Hello, I'm Steve Bonta. I have a longtime scholar of the Indus Valley script, and in the last several years, I've made a significant claim about a partial decipherment of the writing system of the Indus Valley, which you can look at in detail online. I'm trying to get some of the material published in peer-reviewed publications right now. It's been very difficult. And so in the meantime, I think that this material is important enough to warrant actual, further explication online. There are, of course, many, many claims to decipherment. They've proliferated in recent years. Many of them kind of follow a similar methodology, which we'll be talking about. What I decided to do was to prepare a series of lectures to explain in detail the motivation for my claim decipherment. And I should hasten to add, it's a partial decipherment. There's a lot of work yet to be done. Anyone who claims that they've entirely deciphered the Indus Valley script, or for that matter, any ancient script, is probably blowing smoke, because decipherment is a very difficult, oftentimes inexact science, as we shall see. So the best that can be done is to show how I arrived at what I've arrived at. And I thought that a series of actual online tutorials would help, since the monograph and materials that I've made available on my academia.edu site are somewhat lengthy and so forth. But there is a methodology. It is both reproducible and falsifiable. And so, but unfortunately, it's not something that can be encapsulated in a brief 500-word or 1,000-word paper or something of this sort. And so this is one of the challenges, is that really, to provide something that's defensible, I have to have a large monograph with a lot of data, a lot of information, a lot of comparative data, a lot of tables, and most people don't really have the intestinal fortitude to go through all this, and understandably so, because of course there are so many competing claims for decipherment out there. So my purpose here is to in this and the following lectures that I'll be putting online over the next weeks and months, to show, first of all, in general terms, what the Indus Valley script is about, what the sort of science/art of decipherment entails, and then go into some considerable detail about my own decipherment. So I should start probably just very briefly telling you who I am, and perhaps an appeal to authority, in a sense, as to why you should give me the time of day. Okay, I do have a PhD in linguistics from Cornell University. I studied a number of South Asian languages. Done field research in Sri Lanka with Dravidian languages. In point of fact, Tamil was the language, along with Sinhala. Those are the two languages that I used for my field research, documenting a dialect of Tamil spoken by Roman Catholic fishermen in Sri Lanka. And then I've subsequently done, I had a Fulbright research senior fellowship in 2015, in which I began documentation of a dialect of Telugu, which is also spoken in Sri Lanka by itinerant snake charmers. So I've done quite a bit of work as a Dravidianist, as a linguist. And I'm published as a Dravidianist, but I've also studied Sanskrit and Pali and Avestan in great depth over many years. And I began working on the Indus Valley script not long after I graduated, back in the early 1990s. It seemed to me to be first of all, an outstanding problem that was worth looking at, that obviously had already been worked on for decades, as we shall see, and very little progress had been made towards a decipherment. I felt at the time that perhaps it was something that, because of my particular set of interests and maybe my natural skill set with languages and interest in signs and symbols and this kind of thing, that it might be something that I could make a contribution towards. I did end up doing a master's thesis on the subject, on kind of a preliminary way, on a certain aspect of the script, during my time at Brigham Young University, getting a master's in linguistics in the mid-90s. After that, I went to Cornell and did more field linguistics stuff there for my PhD project, and for years after that. I've never received any grants to work on the Indus Valley script as such. It's been very much a labor of love. So, I'm not part of the establishment in the sense that I'm not a tenured professor of archaeology or something like that. In point of fact, at the moment, my only academic position is as an honorary professor at Auror University in Sukkur, Pakistan. So I have a relationship with a university in Pakistan. Sukkur, in fact, is quite close to Mohenjo-Daro, and I visited both Mohenjo-Daro and Kot Diji in recent years and months. So I have kind of a relationship there. But the problem is, as I said, that the Indus Valley script, the writing system of the Indus Valley civilization, which was the largest Bronze Age civilization and the only major writing system, the only major civilization from that time period whose writing system is not yet deciphered, has attracted over the years and decades since its discovery many claims at decipherment, at partial decipherment, this kind of thing. Some of them are very compelling and interesting, others much less so. And in recent years, because of the internet and the proliferation of materials on the internet, there have been many more. And so the attitude among the establishment, the academic establishment, the gatekeepers, if you were, is sort of to dismiss out of hand any and all claims to decipherment of any sort, to assume a priori that whatever claims are made are bunkum, that there's no basis for it. It is often averred that the writing system is too difficult for various reasons that we'll talk about, that it's not decipherable, that the language itself may end up being unknown, and various other things. So it's I think it's safe to say that since for the last 30 years there have been no one has really been allowed to publish anything in like a peer-reviewed journal or an academic press making any claims about decipherment. The most recent of which I'm aware that have made any serious claims are way back in the early 90s, a book by Walter Fairservice and another book by Asko Parpola, both of which made claims about the nature of the language and sought to read some of the Indus signs. And those were both published by established academic presses. And prior to that, there were a number of other books, large and small, and articles in peer-reviewed publications over that made various claims of this sort. But for the last 30 years or so, there's been kind of this blockade, that there's this consensus that, there's just this, it can't be done. So we're kind of in a situation akin to what Carl Sagan once said, the extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, and the default assumption on the part of the gatekeepers is that no such extraordinary evidence is forthcoming. Therefore, this kind of stuff is publishable, so not publishable. So it's very difficult. So I aim to persuade anyone who watches this and subsequent videos that this is in fact not true, that there is a methodology, that there's a way to solve this problem that may be defensible. But we're going to talk about this in great detail. Now, this first lecture, for those of you who are already acquainted with the Indus script and the Indus Valley and the history of decipherment in general, you can probably simply skip over this because this is going to be pretty elementary information for a lot of you. Okay, the second lecture then will go into begin the process of discussing decipherment. And I think, and you won't see my face after this first lecture either, because it will interfere with the coherence of many of the slides. I don't think there'll be a problem with these. So forthwith, let's talk a little bit in an introductory and prefatory way about the Indus Valley civilization, the Indus Valley script, and decipherment in general, so that to kind of set the stage for what's coming. Now, first of all, the image that you see here is a very famous one. It's a part of a seal from the Indus Valley civilization. It's not actually very large physically, a little tiny thing about a couple inches across, with a very interesting motif, a three-headed god in the middle with a buffalo horn headdress surrounded by animals, and seated in a lotus position on a dais, possibly ithyphallic. It's not entirely clear, and then a single inscription across the top of writing. And by the way, I should add that there has been one claim in the last 20 years to the effect that the Indus Valley script is not writing at all. We may have occasion to mention that later on, and I think the rebuttal to that will be in the actual presentation coming forward. So for our purposes, it is writing, but the content is somewhat mysterious. This is the famous Lord of the Beasts, or Pashupati seal, as it's called, the background image. So let's move on to the next image. here, let me see here. There we go. Okay, so here are some pictures that I took myself at Mohenjo-Daro last year. And the one that my picture is partly overlain here, has a later period Buddhist stupa at the very top, but then, the sprawling ruins about. And it's hard to get if you haven't actually been there. Mohenjo-Daro is located not far from the modern city of Larkana in the central Indus Valley, about 4 or 5 hours drive north of Karachi. And it's in a scrub jungle type habitat. So it's not entirely desert. It might look from this picture like it's some sort of a desert without any trees, but actually outside of these excavated areas, the vegetation is fairly lush. It's kind of like a thorn scrub forest with some palm trees and this sort of thing. And also, the site is extremely large. So what you see here in these images are some of the streets that have been, and alleyways and drains and so forth, that have been excavated. And a large part of it has been excavated, but there's a surprising amount that still lies unexcavated, that you can see off in the jungle. So it's a very, very large area, and it is whatever its name may have been. Mohenjo-Daro in the Sindhi language means mound of the dead or tell of the dead. The word, Daro is the equivalent of like the Arabic word tell, or the Turkish word tepe. It means a mound where you have ancient ruins. Anyway, it was definitely the largest, the capital, the cultural capital. Most of the inscribed objects that we have, including the Lord of the Beast seal that we saw on the first slide, come from Mohenjo-Daro. So while we do have inscribed objects from other places like Harappa and Dholavira and so forth and so on, the bulk of them, and particularly many of the most interesting ones, do come from Mohenjo-Daro. And so this seems to have been the cultural and perhaps political center of this great empire, this culture, whatever it called itself. So here are the stars of the show. These are some examples of Harappan seals. And I use the word Harappan. That's an alternate term for the Indus Valley civilization. It's also sometimes called the Indus Gagar civilization. There are various terms. The Indus is the actual name of the river. For the uninitiated, it's one of the world's great river systems. It flows up primarily through Pakistan. It arises, of course, in the high Karakoram Himalayan mountain range far to the north. And then, literally is the lifeblood of modern-day Pakistan. Most of the Indus River civilization, in fact, was located in what is now Pakistan and not India. There are some significant sites across the border in India, the aforementioned Dholavira, Lothal, and a few others. But most of the big ones, Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro in particular, are in Pakistan, not in India, because that's where the Indus Valley primarily is. And for those of you that have never been, the Indus Valley is anywhere from 10 to 30, 40 miles wide. And in that area is a typical, very lush floodplain with, marshes and, rice fields and, this kind of thing, quite fertile. But on each side is pretty much desert. So to the east, you have the Thar Desert. The Cholistan Desert is called further north, one of the hottest, driest deserts in the earth. Interestingly, at one time it was less desert. There are actual Indus sites in the Cholistan Desert, like Ganwariwala, that one time must have been a bit more watered. Okay, and to the west you have the equally barren mountains of Baluchistan and so forth. But in the middle you have this remarkable conduit of water and food and civilization and everything else, and it's a fascinating place. Now, these seals that you see here, and you can see the Lord of the Beast seal up the upper left, are the primary examples of inscribed objects, the Indus Valley script. Okay, and most of them have very brief inscriptions, as you can see. So, looking at this one here, this is a very canonical seal, the upper right, in which you have what's called the unicorn bull motif. So this is a bull-like animal, bovine animal, that seems to have but a single horn, hence the term unicorn bull. Now, it may be because stylistically the animal is being shown in profile, although if that's the case, why do we see 4 legs rather than 2? It's a little bit of a curious feature. So people argue as to whether it's actually a real animal or some sort of a mythical unicorn bovine of some kind. But anyway, the vast majority of seals that have a field figure feature this unicorn bull, and in front of it, that odd flower-like device that is usually just sort of called a ritual device, or perhaps a feeding trough. It has that it always had that funny crescent moon like thing down below. In my opinion, it probably represents the heavens and the earth, or it's some sort of a cosmic. I don't know, but whatever it is, it's always there. It's somewhat mysterious, as is the unicorn bull itself. It's pretty much always represented the same way, with the horn, with the funny little heart-shaped folds there in the shoulder, the wrinkles in the head, and so forth, and then a line of inscription across the top. All right. So the direction of writing in this case happens to be left to right, but the canonical writing, when we actually look at inscriptions, as we will in tabulated form in later lectures, it'll be represented right to left, because, of course, this being a seal means when you make an impression of it, the direction of the writing will be reversed. You can see that other seals have other devices. Elephants, here we have a zebu, a humped cow, and there are other animals. Gharials, the South Asian narrow-snouted crocodile, crops up. Tigers crop up. Occasionally, mythical animals that are clearly congeries of several different animals glommed together. All of these make their appearance on the seals. But the writing is, as you see, typically one or at most two lines, very brief. And this, as we shall see, does pose a problem for would-be decipherer. Now, this is a man named Alexander Cunningham, and he presided over the Archaeological Survey of India way back in the 19th century, and he was probably the first person to recognize the existence of this theretofore unrecognized ancient civilization. He collected a few Indus seals and other artifacts. But the man who usually gets most of the credit for the excavations, even though he didn't necessarily do a lot of the dirty work, is this man. This is Marshall, and he was Cunningham's successor, director of the Indian Archaeological Survey. He supervised archaeological digs at both Mohenjo-daro and Harappa, or at least authorized them. I don't know how much he was actually on site. A lot of the digging itself was carried out by local archaeologists, people like Lal and so forth, in the 1920s and 1930s. But Harappa and Mohenjo-daro were the two, both in modern-day Pakistan. Of course, in those days, it was all just part of British India. But those were the two original sites that were dug up, and under Marshall's guidance, very, very elaborate expedition reports were produced. They're very valuable. Tabulate all of the articles that were found, including, of course, many seals and potsherds and toys and things like all the things that turned up at those sites. So, in some sense, Marshall could be considered the father of Indus or Harappan archaeology. All right. So here's kind of what we know just based on carbon dating, other things, the more or less the civilization timeline for the Indus or Harappan civilization. Now, as I said, it corresponds roughly to what we call the Bronze Age, but it goes back many millennia BC, or BCE if you prefer, starting with the so-called Mehrgar, the Neolithic Mehrgar culture, Mehrgar being a site actually in Baluchistan to the west of the Indus Valley. And then transitioning into the early Harappan, the pre-urban phase of the Harappan, from about 3300 to 2600 BC. And then, the two earlier other Harappan phases. You can see Harappan 1, Harappan 2. The Kotdiji phase is interesting. Kotdiji is the name of a site not too far from Mohenjo-daro, actually. It's the site of a very famous fort, which I visited this year. Fascinating place. And then there's a small dado there, also a small tell corresponding to an early Harappan site in the same area. So these are various phases designated by archaeologists. The mature Harappan phase is the one that concerns us the most. So the dates here, about 2600 to 1900 BC. This is when the bulk of the interesting artifacts from our point of view, the inscribed artifacts with the writing system, the seals, and other things, the potsherds, there's some potsherds, there's some ceilings, a few implement heads that have writing on them, one signboard from Dolavira, which is kind of a unique artifact as well. So all of these are coming out of the mature Harappan phase, which corresponds to the phase in which the Harappans or the Indus people were building cities. And they were very sophisticated cities. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here, but suffice it to say that the level of civil engineering evident in places like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa was the best for its age in terms of the sewer systems, the drains, things of this nature, and were not equaled or much less surpassed until the time of Rome, almost 2 millennia later. So in some respects, this was a very technologically advanced civilization. Although curiously, there is, in spite of the sophistication and regularity with which their cities and towns were laid out, that betray a very strong aptitude for civil engineering, there's relatively little other stuff that one would expect. For example, we don't find remains of any wheeled vehicles. There are a few toys that are like carts. They must have had carts and things like this, but we don't find those. We don't find evidence for statuaries. Large buildings, with pillars and stuff like that. The buildings are all built out of, burnt brick, and are very uniform in appearance. There's none of the striking architecture typical of ancient Egypt or Mesopotamia or anything like that. So in some ways, and if you travel in the Indus Valley today, one of the striking things is how much modern day buildings in the Sindh still resemble what you see at ruins like Mohenjo-Daro. You see they're kind of the same very square, structures made out of burnt bricks. They still have brick manufactories all over the Indus Valley. These big chimneys where they with the ovens where they bake bricks. And so the mode of construction does not seem to have changed much over the millennia. Now, subsequent to the mature Harappan, there's the late and post-Harappan periods. The painted grayware culture, the culture, the post-urban culture that succeeded the Harappan culture is definitely Indo-Aryan. So Indo-Aryan means related to the Indo-Aryan language and cultures of North India. So that would include languages like Hindi and Bengali and Urdu and Punjabi and so forth, and as distinct from the Dravidian languages of the southern subcontinent, such as Tamil and Telugu, and also distinct from Indo-Iranian languages from the Iranian plateau and other groups from the Tibetan languages and so forth and so on. Okay, so anyway, the debate, of course, is whether or not the Harappans were themselves Indo-Aryan or perhaps Dravidian or perhaps something else, and we'll get into that much more later on. Okay, so here's a map of the Indus Valley civilization and in the mature phase, and you can see from this map just how large it is. If you have any appreciation for how big Pakistan and India are, this was the most extensive of all of the Bronze Age civilizations geographically. And frankly, this may not be the whole picture. It's not clear, for example, there may be other sites, here and elsewhere that have yet to be unearthed. And you can see up here at Shortugai, clear up in Afghanistan, there's an outpost as well. And moreover, it's shown on the map here, but it's clear that this civilization traded with the Middle East. Harappan artifacts including seals, have been found on the island of Bahrain, for example, in the Persian Gulf and elsewhere in Mesopotamia. So clearly this civilization had intercourse with the civilizations of the Arabian Peninsula, or the culture of the Arabian Peninsula and Mesopotamia, minimally at that time. All right. So let's talk a little bit more generally about the subject of decipherment. That's going to be the main focus. I'm not an archaeologist per se. And so we're not going to talk much more about, just the archaeology. There are plenty of resources online if you're more curious about the archaeological details of the Indus civilization. We're going to be talking primarily about the writing system. And so that presupposes some understanding of what we're talking about when we talk about deciphering a writing system. So, the canonical example is probably this one, the decipherment of the Egyptian hieroglyphs, which was achieved primarily by two men. One on the left, the polymath Thomas Young, who was one of the brightest human beings ever to walk the face of this earth. Thomas Young, in addition to making seminal contributions to the decipherment of the Egyptian hieroglyphs, was a scientist of first rank, made very, very significant contributions to physics, chemistry, mathematics, and other things as well. So he in fact, he has been called the last man to know everything, was Thomas Young. Now on the right, the somewhat out of focus picture, I couldn't get anything clearer than that, is Jean-François Champollion, who is the man who carried Thomas Young, and other people like Sacy had also made early contributions to the Egyptian hieroglyphs. But Champollion was the guy who really, really broke through. I mean, Thomas Young achieved the first breakthroughs and made some critical identifications about, in using the material and what's called the Rosetta Stone, which is what's shown in the middle. More about that in a second. But Champollion was the guy who made it his life's work. He was a language prodigy who felt from very early age that it was going to be his calling in life to decipher the hieroglyphs. Now, when we talk about ancient Egyptian, we're talking about more than one writing system. So in fact, there was also the hieratic writing system and the demotic writing system, which are more simplified versions of Egyptian. But the hieroglyphic writing, the hieroglyphics were the most interesting, because they were the ones that graced the tombs, obviously, and the temples and all of this stuff in sarcophagi in ancient Egypt, the papyri, thousands of papyri in hieroglyphics. Written hieroglyphics were available. There's a vast amount of literature. Unlike, by the way, the Indus Valley corpus, as it's called, which consists of maybe 5,000 or 6,000 short inscriptions. The corpus of Egyptian hieroglyphs is truly tremendous. So a vast amount of material, but an immensely complex writing system as well. And it took Champollion, despite his considerable genius, decades to figure it out. And he was, because of the jealousy of his colleagues, he was never given due credit for it in his lifetime. He used this object you see in the middle, the Rosetta Stone, which was discovered basically being used as a part of a wall by Napoleon's troops. Well, he brought a bunch of scientists and archaeologists with him when he invaded Egypt during the Napoleonic Wars. And one of them found this and said, oh, this could be valuable, because it was clearly writing in several different languages, presumably the same thing. And importantly, one of those languages was Greek. Okay, so they had what was called a bilingual, which means they had an actual sample of writing in more than one languages. One of those languages was known, and so that could conceivably be used as some kind of a crib, or as I like to say, an entering wedge to figure out the hieroglyphs. But because of the immense complexity of this writing system, the only other writing system devised by man of comparable complexity would be, of course, the Chinese writing system, which also consists of tens of thousands of different signs. It still took many very bright men, culminating in the exertions of Champollion, decades to figure out. And to this day, the work is not complete. There are still glyphs that are not readable, or whose exact pronunciation is disputed by Egyptologists. Egyptology is still very much a living field. And this is one of the things that people who have never been involved in decipherment perhaps don't understand or sufficiently appreciate. And that is, the decipherment is always a work in progress. It's never, unless you devise a crystal ball or a time machine, can literally get to the point where you can go back in time somehow and have an absolute certainty of what the language is. Barring that, you're always going to be, it's an iterative process. You're always going to be, finding more and more out about the system as new information comes to light, So for example, the Mayan decipherment, depending on whom you talk to, is anywhere from 70 to 95% done, but it's not done. There are still a number of Mayan glyphs that haven't been read. It's still very much an active research. And so this is true of all these writing systems. So something to bear in mind. All right. Well, let's move on. So this is one of my favorite stories. This is Grotefend, who was actually a German schoolmaster who basically made a bet at a beer hall one day that he could decipher Persian cuneiform. Now, cuneiform is a type of writing devised in Mesopotamia, again during the Bronze Age. The word means wedge-shaped, from the Latin word cuneus, which means wedge, and you can see why. Cuneiform characters were produced by a little stylus that would have a little wedge-shaped thing at the end, and you just basically impress it into mud, like into a mud or clay tablet, and impress it in various ways. And each of the characters is made up of different wedges. There are basically two types of wedges: the long, narrow ones, and the Winkelhakel, the broad ones here. I have to admit, the only cuneiform I ever studied was Hittite cuneiform many decades ago. So I'm not a cuneiform expert by any means. But cuneiform was the first international writing system in that it was used to write a number of different languages. So not just Sumerian, which seems to be where it originated, but later it was also used for Elamite, mature Elamite, for Eblite, for Akkadian, and for Persian. In fact, Old Persian, as it's called, was probably the last language to use the cuneiform writing system, and it was it was actually the simplest version of cuneiform, because for writing Persian, as it turned out, they ended up with just a few dozen characters and distilled it down to a simple syllabary. And this is what Grotefend tackled and became the first person to break through into any cuneiform system. Now, he was followed by these three men who are sometimes called the Holy Trinity of Assyriology. So Edmund Hincks, Rawlinson, and Jules Oppert, I guess is German. These three men worked for decades in the middle of the 19th century to try to decipher Akkadian and Persian cuneiform. And Hincks, the man at the top, he was actually a minister, an ordained minister. And so this was a kind of a labor of love on his part. He was probably the guy that did the most work, but the person who got the most credit was Rawlinson, the fellow down here on the right. He was an adventurer, very flamboyant personality who was known for, he traveled to what is now Iran and literally climbed up the cliffs at a place called Behistun and copied down, at considerable personal risk, copied down this trilingual cuneiform inscription that had been carved in the cliff, which you can see here, part of in this image, carved by none other than the Emperor Darius himself in several different languages. And because there were these three different men were working on it more or less independently, at a certain point, the scholarly community decided, in a fit of magnanimity, I guess, that you wouldn't find nowadays, said, well, let's see if these guys, if there's any propriety to it. And so what they did was they gave all three of them the same text, a text that none of them had ever seen before. Again, there are a lot of texts available in cuneiform, in these various cuneiform languages, because there are tens and tens of thousands of tablets and so forth have been excavated from the Middle East, from various sites already by the 1800s. So all three men were presented with the same text, and they were said, decipher it. What does it say? And all three of them produced essentially the same result. And because of that, the scholarly community said, okay, guess they have it. And so at that point, it was acknowledged that cuneiform had been not Sumerian cuneiform. That was later, but basically Persian and Akkadian cuneiform was at least at the beginning of understanding. So this is a remarkable result. Again, the texts here are long and copious. So although the way that the way that Grotefend first broke through was that he exploited the fact that we knew the names of some of the Persian emperors thanks to the records of Herodotus. We knew the names of Cyrus and Darius and some of the others, and so he was able to use that kind of an entering wedge to try to figure out what was going on. Anyway, I don't want to go into too much detail here. Let's move on to the next one. So this is James Prinsep, the greatest decipherer most people have never heard of. He was the man who really cracked open the ancient languages of the Indian subcontinent. Now, not ancient as in Bronze Age ancient, but this is he was the man who deciphered the Brahmi script and also the Kharoshthi script, which are two of the very ancient writing systems, meaning from the last 2,000 years or so. And they represent, Brahmi and Kharoshthi and a couple of others, represent the starting point of literacy in the subcontinent post the Indus Valley. Because after the collapse of the Indus Valley, there's no evidence that writing of any form was used in the subcontinent until the sudden appearance of the Brahmi script and the time of the Emperor Ashoka, who began inscribing these pillars with, describing his actions, his conquests, and so forth, found all over India, and so then Brahmi becomes the ancestral script of most of the modern Indian scripts. In fact, it works kind of the same way as the Tamil script and the the Devanagari script that's used for Hindi and Sanskrit and so forth. Namely, it's called an Abugida script or an alpha syllabic script, and I don't have time to really describe how it works. But in effect, the Brahmi script seems to be ancestor to all the modern writing systems in India, except for the Perso-Arabic script and maybe a few others, but most of the major languages of India use a modern script that operates on the same principle. All right, and so Prinsep was the guy that unlocked that, and he's often forgotten and underappreciated. All right, so here's another one, a personal hero of mine. This is Michael Ventris, and of all of the decipherments that have taken place, this one probably resembles, or at least the material, the corpus available to Michael Ventris, probably resembles what we have with the Indus Valley more than any other successful decipherment. I'm referring, of course, to the decipherment of Linear B, which, as it turns out, was an early form, a Bronze Age form of Greek that was used by the kingdom of Crete, by Mycenaean Greece, as it's called, which was basically when we think of Greece, we think of city-states and democracies, but that's actually Iron Age Greece. That's much later. That's the Greece from historical times, Herodotus and onward. I'm talking now about the Greece from the Bronze Age, which is in some ways still prehistoric, because these writings that were deciphered by Ventris, who was also an amateur, by the way, he was an architect by profession, although he was also very well trained in classical Greek and Latin and this kind of thing. In any event, what Ventris had as material were thousands and thousands of very small tablets that were, as he correctly surmised, warehouse receipts. So again, no great bodies of literature or votive prayers or anything like that, just warehouse receipts, very mundane materials. But the interesting thing is that the experts in the field, Arthur Evans in particular, who was the man who first excavated the palace at Knossos and so forth, and was still alive when Michael Ventris was a young man. He met Sir Arthur Evans. And Arthur Evans was of the opinion that this was a pre-Greek civilization, and so that whatever the language of Linear B was, it was definitely not going to be Greek. But Michael Ventris, following the lead of an American scholar named Alice Cobers, who went through and started using sort of a comparative method to ascertain that there was evidence for inflectional endings on some of the words that she found occurring repeatedly in the inscriptions, eventually reached the conclusion that in fact it was an archaic form of Greek. And the inscription, the decipherment was accepted upon its being successfully applied to some material that Ventris had not had access to, that was brought to light, and it showed that his decipherment was largely correct. Unfortunately, Ventris did not long outlive the announcement of his discovery. He was killed in a car crash as a relatively young man. So let's see. Let's move on. Let's talk about the Indus script per se. Now, this man, Iravatam Mahadevan, I am proud to say, was a friend of mine. He's been deceased now for 7-8 years, but a truly great man, and just an absolute gentleman. I met him some years back when I was in Madras presenting on the script. I was able to have dinner at his house, and corresponded with him subsequently for many years. He is probably the seminal figure in the decipherment of the Indus script, because back in the late 1970s, he prepared a wonderful, very hard to obtain nowadays, but a wonderful concordance of all of the then known Indus texts, and they're carefully cross-indexed and listed according to sign. I mean, it's not a perfect work. It does have some errors, but in terms of its organization, it is without parallel. And it was what I used for many years until the internet kind of came along, and there was some online materials that were able to surpass it in utility. But the Mahadevan Concordance of the Indus texts, published way back in 1978 or thereabouts, is still a model of careful organization and compilation of such data as was then available. Now, Mahadevan was not just some dude either, although he also was never a professional academic. He was actually a civil servant for all of his life for the state of India. But he did have a successful decipherment to his credit. He deciphered the Tamil Brahmi writings of South India, whereby the Brahmi script, the aforementioned Brahmi script, was applied in modified form to record an early form of the Tamil language. Mahadevan himself from Madras was Tamil. Okay, so anyway, but he was a very, very honored scholar, and again, having known him personally, he was a gentleman besides, and that's all too rare a combination. So let's talk briefly, before concluding today's lecture, on the nature of the corpus itself. I keep using this term corpus. Corpus means the whole body of available inscriptions. There's a whole subdiscipline in linguistics called corpus linguistics, where people literally study very large samplings of the use of a language for a variety of reasons. Sometimes people use corpus linguistics to try to preserve endangered languages and this kind of thing. But the term corpus refers to the totality of available linguistic evidence. In this case, inscriptions. Okay, so this is important going forward because it points up the difficulty of the puzzle that we're going to be dealing with. First of all, there are many very brief inscriptions and zero lengthy inscriptions. The longest inscription in the Harappan corpus is something like 26 characters long, and it is truly exceptional. Most of the longer inscriptions, might be 8 or 10 signs long, as opposed to 3 or 4 signs long. I mean, an 8 or 10 sign long inscription is quite exceptional already. So the reason this is a problem, of course, is that longer inscriptions, if you have a long papyrus or a long inscription on a cliff or a cave wall or something like that, will give a lot more information about the morphosyntax of a language. It's just a fact that it's much easier to look at it and say, okay, well, we have this large sample, like the Rosetta Stone, for example, a large sampling of language, and you can kind of say, okay, you can observe the repetition of signs and the patterning of words and infer perhaps which words might be verbs and nouns and things of this nature, right? But with these very brief inscriptions, and I should add very repetitive inscriptions, a number of inscriptions occur multiple times in the Indus corpus. Okay, it's much more difficult to make statements about the manner in which these signs are employed. Next one, no bilinguals. None. There's no Rosetta Stone. There's no Canopus decree. There's no Landa syllabary or anything like this. Just to name several celebrated bilinguals that have helped in the decipherment of other writing systems. No such have ever been found for the Indus script. There are several inscriptions from Middle Eastern sources where the signs pattern very differently from anything found in the Indus Valley. I mean, they're using Indus signs, but in a very different way. And so apparently they're basically recording completely foreign words or names, but using the Indus script. But there are only like 4 or 5 such examples of those, and they're very brief. So it's hard to see how they could have much utility. The next one is the language is unknown. I mean, a priori, we don't know. There are several candidate languages or language families, but we don't know going into it that we're dealing with this particular language. And this is different from, for example, what faced by Prinsep when he deciphered the Brahmi script. He would have known that he was dealing with essentially some form of Sanskrit or perhaps Middle Indo-Aryan, but languages that were already basically known. just as when Mahadevan deciphered Tamil Brahmi, he knew that the underlying language would be an early form of Tamil. We don't enjoy any such luxury where the Indus writing is concerned. Okay. And then finally, we don't have any known toponyms, which means place names, or demonyms, meaning the names of people, or king names. These are other useful cribs that have been used. I mentioned that Grotefend made use of king names in kind of prizing his way into Persian cuneiform. We have no such. One of the tricks used by both Thomas Young and Champollion with regard to the hieroglyphs was recognizing that certain figures enclosed inside what was called a cartouche probably represented the names of royalty as well. And so that became an invaluable clue. None of those things are available for the Indus script. So the question becomes, how in the world can we make any progress toward decipherment? I'm not going to answer that today because we pretty much run out of time. This is supposed to be a 20-minute lecture, and it's 45 minutes instead, but I'll give you a preview here of coming attractions. So lecture 2, we're going to talk about the languages of South Asia, kind of another background lecture, so that you have some idea of what we're talking about in terms of the possibilities for an underlying language or languages for the Indus writing. And then you can see the rest of them from lectures 3 through 10 will be about the script proper once we've laid down the foundation. And I hope that I will present them in an orderly enough fashion that you'll be able to follow the logic behind it. And we'll also talk about some things that don't work for decipherment, some methodologies that have been used by other people, and the reason that probably they can be dismissed. I just want to say one more thing, and that is that in no way is this or any of the other presentations to be construed as anything disrespectful of anyone who has attempted to decipher this writing system. I've worked on this for more than 35 years myself. In some ways, it's been my life's work. I can appreciate as much as anyone alive how difficult this is, and respect anyone who's willing to give it a try, whether or not I might deem their work wrong-headed or not. Unfortunately, in this discipline, there are historically there's been a lot of a tendency to disrespect and ridicule people, and I just think that's very inappropriate. So I'm not going to be dealing with that. I'm not going to be trying to to refute or ridicule or to shoot down other people, obviously whom I would disagree with, because I have my approach here, and so forth. But I do think that something like this, this is something that very few people are willing to undertake, because it invites very hard scrutiny, ridicule, marginalization. And in fact, the history of decipherment generally, we haven't gone into all of it, but it's always attracted people who are, shall we say, marched to a different drummer. That's particularly true of the Mayan decipherment. If you look at many of the really interesting characters that are involved in the very long march toward the decipherment of the Mayan glyphs, a lot of them were really, really pretty eccentric. But it kind of comes with the territory. And so this is not the kind of thing that you ought to do if you aspire to have a safe, tenure job or something. It's not. If you're not doing it as a labor of love, you probably aren't doing it at all. So for that reason, my kudos to everyone who has ever attempted to do this, and to everyone who's contributed and who has an interest in this. This is just such an important topic. It has bearing on two of the world's greatest countries. I mean, I've spent a lot of time in both India and Pakistan. I have a great love for the people of South Asia, the most numerous people on the face of the earth. It's a truly amazing part of the world. And obviously, some of the political divisions are unfortunate, but what an extraordinary place. And so, to be able to make some contribution, however modest, to elucidating this great primordial civilization of South Asia has been a signal honor on my part. And so it's for that reason that I'm motivated to share this with you, And then, as they say, let the chips fall where they may. Well, that concludes lecture number 1, and we'll be back in due course with lecture 2 and beyond. Thank you very much.